Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Research Series. In this series, I will be presenting and discussing some of my own original research, which covers a broad range of topics in Japanese Buddhism, and discussing it in the context of East Asian Buddhism and other disciplines broadly. Today's project is my foray into pre-modern Japanese Buddhist art and architecture history. It is titled Chōgen's Tōdaiji Campaign, Reconstruction and Reimagination. It concerns the reconstruction of the famous Japanese Buddhist temple, Tōdaiji, after its destruction by fire in the Genpei War, which lasted from 1180 to 1185 Common Era in Japan. In the course of this reconstruction, the temple, which we will introduce and discuss in more depth, was reimagined in a fascinating way. Whereas for most of its history it had been dedicated to Vairocana Buddha, the primary Buddha in esoteric Shingon Buddhism, it was reconstructed in a grand project overseen by this monk Chōgen, and it was reimagined and redesigned as a temple space connected to Pure Land Buddhism and to Amida Buddha. This marks a transition between esoteric and exoteric. Remember that esoteric means the hidden or secret teachings of the Buddha, and it is a classification that includes the Shingon and Tendai schools of Buddhism. Exoteric refers to the revealed and the spoken teachings of the Buddha, and it refers to all other kinds of Buddhism, in this case including Pure Land, Nichiren, and Zen Buddhism. This project explores the question of how and why this change occurred. As such, we will begin with an introduction to Tōdaiji and its role in Japanese history leading up to the events in question, namely the destruction of the temple and Chōgen's selection as the overseer of the reconstruction project. Next, we will discuss current opinions on the matter and my argument. Using examples of other spaces that Chōgen envisioned throughout his career, I argue that the nature and purpose of Tōdaiji temple space was reimagined from being a strictly esoteric space to a mixed-use esoteric-exoteric place. Because of that, I argue that the reimagination of the great Buddha statue in Chōgen's reconstruction campaign cuts across the boundaries of social and religious authority laid out by famous Japanese historian Kuroda Toshio in his Kenmitsu Taisei theory, which held that the esoteric Shingon and Tendai schools of Buddhism predominantly fulfilled ritual functions for the ruling elite, while the exoteric schools fulfilled those functions for everybody else. I hope you enjoy. Let's begin our discussion with Tōdaiji. Tōdaiji is located in present-day Nara Prefecture in the old Nara period imperial capital known as Heijō-kyo. Tōdaiji's name translates to Eastern Great Temple. There is indeed a Western Great Temple as well, known as Saidaiji, and these temples were situated on either side of a grand avenue that went north-south in the center of the city of Heijō-kyo, called Grand Phoenix Avenue. Tōdaiji was constructed first out of the two. Its origins date back to 728 Common Era, when Emperor Shomu established Kinsho Senji on the site of Tōdaiji as a mortuary site for Prince Motoi, who had died as an infant. However, as time went on, Japan suffered from several natural disasters, political unrest, and epidemics, and the temple was re-established by an imperial edict as Tōdaiji, a national temple serving as the head institution of a network of provincial temples all across the country. Tōdaiji and this network of temples were established primarily for at least three reasons. The first was as a means of repairing the well-being of Japan. It was thought that, by patronizing such a large network of Buddhist temples, the emperor and the nation could acquire good merit, which would remedy the unrest and calamity striking the country. The second was to create a network of temples that served as symbols of the interdependent relationship between the power of the emperor and the power of Buddhism in a system known as Obo Buppo in Heian period Japan. Worshipping at imperially patronized temples funneled religious authority toward the imperial household. The third reason was to consolidate power in the nation under the emperor and its dual aspects as being derived and providential of Buddhist institutional power through the creation and utilization of labor and resource networks under a singular national project. The temple was dedicated to the worship of Vairocana, the cosmic Buddha of esoteric Buddhism. It's speculated that the reason for this was that in China, Empress Wu had similarly commissioned giant Buddha statues which were aimed at presenting the empress herself as being one with Vairocana Buddha. Vairocana is also known as the Great Sun Buddha, and in Shinto, the goddess of the sun, known as Amaterasu, is known as the divine progenitor of the imperial family. So, by aligning himself with this Buddha, the Japanese emperor had divine legitimacy both from Buddhism and Shinto. That is another reason why Japan is called the land of the rising sun, is because of Amaterasu. So this temple had a strong symbolic function, but it also had a strong administrative function. This temple served as the administrative headquarters for what are known as the 6 Nara schools of Buddhism, known as Hosso, Keigon, Jōjitsu, Sanron, Ritsu, and Kusha. Hosso is the Yogacara school. Keigon is the Huayan, or flower garland school. Jōjitsu is the Abhidharma school. Sanron is the Madhyamaka school. Ritsu is the Vinaya school. And Kusha is the Japanese Theravada school. Thus, Tōdaiji was one of the primary centers of religious authority in all of Japan. Monks from all of these schools received their ordination on the site of Tōdaiji. Even famous ones like Kūkai and Saicho received their ordination here. The imperial family also received symbolic ordinations here as well. It was common for older, retired, or abdicated emperors and empresses to be ordained under this ordination platform. Later, in 810 Common Era, Kūkai was placed in charge of the temple and the imperial office that oversaw it, and, by extension, the national network of temples under it. During his tenure, he reformed Japanese esoteric Buddhism as we know it. As the emperor continually placed him in charge of more esoteric rites and temple projects, he became perhaps the most important Buddhist monk in all of Japan. He added esoteric rites to the temple's ordination system, such as Abhisheka, wherein an esoteric monk is initiated into the teaching, and he took over the performance of many rituals of state preservation from the masters of the Nara schools. When the emperor Saga fell ill and an unsuccessful rebellion was mounted against him, Kūkai petitioned the emperor to allow him to carry out certain esoteric rituals which were said to, quote, enable a king to vanquish the 7 calamities, to maintain the 4 seasons in harmony, to protect the nation and family, and to give comfort to himself and others, unquote. The petition was granted, and he began implementing such rituals as chanting the Golden Light Sutra, the Konko Myōkyō, and the Benevolent King Sutra, Nin-no-kyō. The emperor's role as the steward and patron of the Buddhist teachings in the nation was derived from these Buddhist scriptures. These texts are famous for the fact that the audience in which the Buddha is preaching to in each one is not regular lay people or monks and bodhisattvas, but it's actually kings and the ruling class. In the case of the Benevolent King Sutra, the Nin-no-kyō, although it is thought to have been originally composed in China and thus being apocryphal, it has been critically important in Japanese history as a doctrinal foundation that prescribed the role of the emperor in the protection, patronage, and promulgation of Buddhism in Japan as a means of protection of the welfare of the people. This welfare was spiritual in that people were becoming enlightened by the Dharma that was blossoming under the emperor's stewardship, but it was also worldly in that the emperor's stewardship of the Buddha's teachings was also said to protect the nation from foreign invasion, from natural disaster, and from internal unrest. Unlike the Benevolent King Sutra, the Nin-no-kyō, the Golden Light Sutra, or the Konko Myōkyō, does exist in Sanskrit, and it similarly advocates that the ruler ought to serve as an exemplary Buddhist for his people, and that in doing so, the 4 heavenly kings, or the Shiten-no, will protect the ruler and his nation. These texts together came to be fundamental in the understanding of the role the emperor had to play in the stewardship of Japanese Buddhism in the Heian period and beyond, but they also significantly center the emperor in a Buddhist cosmology where he and the Buddha work side by side for the welfare of the nation and its people. Tōdaiji remained the head temple of Shingon and the 6 Nara schools for a long time until several factors contributed to its decline in authority. Some of these factors include the capital being moved away from Heijōkyō in Nara to present-day Kyoto in 794 CE. Another instance is a schism occurring in the Shingon sect after Kūkai's death. Also, we can attribute this decline in authority to the decline of the Nara schools of Buddhism in popularity and the growing religious authority of the Tendai school, which was located closer to the new capital in Kyoto and which took over many of the ritual functions of Tōdaiji and the 6 Nara schools. This brings us up roughly to the time of the Genpei War, which we should discuss now. The Genpei War was a civil war between 2 rivaling clans that took place from 1180 to 1185 Common Era. The rivaling clans were the Taira and Minamoto clans. Both clans aimed to exert their influence over the imperial household through subtle means, such as marriage into it and political intrigue, and through less subtle means as well, such as militarized rebellions. The Taira clan was backed by the imperial household, however, and the Minamoto clan sought to overthrow the Taira clan's influence and gain control over all of Japan. During the course of this war, the Buddhist temple Tōdaiji and the enormous statue of Mahavairocana Buddha, known in Japanese as Dainichi Nyorai, within, were both destroyed by fire when soldiers under the command of Taira no Shigehira seized the capital city of Heijōkyō. The end of this war marked the end of the Heian period and the beginning of the Kamakura period, so named because the victorious Minamoto clan went on to establish a military government in the city of Kamakura, about 2 hours south of present-day Tokyo by car. When the Kamakura shogunate was established at the end of the war, there was a remarkable shift in Buddhist institutional power. That is to say that when the Kamakura shogunate was established at the end of the war, the Taira clan and the imperial family lost a great deal of their political authority, and the state-aligned Tendai and Shingon institutions similarly lost religious authority. After Tōdaiji's destruction, the strength of the network of temples organized under it declined, and this power shift broadly contributed to some of the reforms and innovations that are now called Kamakura Buddhism. The Kamakura period was rife with natural disasters, foreign invasions, epidemics, and famines, and this caused there to be movements to try and alleviate the immediate suffering of the people. Similarly, the Tendai and Shingon institutions were coming to be seen as being archaic, inaccessible, and ineffective at preserving the welfare of the nation. Against this backdrop, more democratized Buddhisms, such as Pure Land Buddhism, Nichiren Buddhism, and Zen Buddhism, began to appear. At the core of these Buddhisms were practices and doctrines which sought to alleviate the immediate suffering of the country in ways that were no longer bound to the state. Kuroda Toshio argues that these Kamakura Buddhist schools did not immediately dominate medieval Japanese society, and instead, he argues that the system of Buddhist power in the Kamakura period could be described according to his famous Kenmitsu Taisei theory. This theory holds that the older Heian Buddhist schools of Tendai, Shingon, Keigon, and Hosso, and the new Kamakura schools of Zen, Jōdo, and Nichiren existed in an esoteric-exoteric system, wherein the esoteric schools of Tendai and Shingon were more dominant and were represented by more powerful organizations, such as those that were centered at the temple of Kofukuji, Tōji, Enryakuji, and Tōdaiji. During the Kamakura period, these schools were still closely attached to the state, and they performed ritual functions for the ruling elite and the imperial family. On the other hand, he argues, the exoteric schools of Zen, Jōdo, and Nichiren were less dominant, and they were less closely attached to the state. Additionally, they were less ritually important for the ruling elite. The development of the Kamakura reform schools in this fashion created an affective or emotional distance between the esoteric institutions and the reform schools, even when the two were still closely affiliated. That disconnect was reflected by the increasing popularity of Pure Land Buddhism during the Kamakura period. This becomes critically important for what motivated Chōgen's interest in Pure Land Buddhism and his campaign of complementarity during his Reconstruction campaign of Tōdaiji, which we will discuss soon. Kuroda's theory has come to be a landmark description of the political and religious landscape of medieval Japanese history, but it is not without its shortcomings. On the one hand, it seems to draw a sharp distinction between Kamakura schools of Buddhism, such as Pure Land, Nichiren, and Zen, and the Heian schools of Tendai and Shingon. This distinction can be said, roughly, to have been drawn along lines of social, political, and religious authority. That is to say that the theory regards esoteric Buddhism as the Buddhism of the elite ruling class, while exoteric Buddhism is the Buddhism of everybody else. This distinction, however, is not as sharp as Kuroda's theory would suggest. The reformers who are said to have founded those schools of Buddhism were originally all ordained in the Heian period state-affiliated Buddhist school of Tendai, every single one of them. That is, Honen of Pure Land, Nichiren of Nichiren Buddhism, and Dogen and Eisai of Zen Buddhism. By the time of Chōgen's campaign, these schools had not fully separated themselves from the institution of Tendai. Similarly, while it may be true that the ruling elites and the imperial family all remain closely affiliated with the esoteric schools of Shingon and Tendai into the medieval period, this theory does not account for the fact that the reformers who founded these new Kamakura schools were not the first people to bring their respective doctrines into Japanese Buddhism. They may have been the first to challenge the imperial esoteric Buddhist institution on the grounds of these doctrines, but that they even had access to those texts which served as their doctrinal foundations for their reforms speaks to the fact that their respective religious consciousnesses might have already infiltrated Japanese Buddhism prior to their reforms, and that they might have all been the crest on a rising tide of Buddhist reform that had already been growing in Japanese Buddhist institutions. To go one step further, it should also be noted that religious centers of authority, including but not limited to Tōdai-Ji, were reimagined and reconstructed in manners that cut across this distinction, in that they took on esoteric and exoteric characteristics at the same time. Before any analysis can be leveled to Chōgen himself or to the fruits of his reconstruction campaign, an analysis and discussion of the reasons for the reconstruction of Tōdai-Ji must be laid out. Then, Chōgen's role in it, the underlying principles and assumptions present in his reconstruction campaign, and the origins of his doctrine of the complementarity between esoteric and exoteric Buddhism will be given. The reasons for Tōdai-Ji's reconstruction contain some similarities to the reasons for its initial establishment at the top of the nationwide network of temples in the 8th century, but the circumstances and the motivations of the parties involved are remarkably different. To prioritize mobilizing money and resources for the reconstruction of a destroyed temple in the midst of the chaos and destruction of the Genpei War and the relocation of the government from Kyoto to Kamakura to a military government required very strong justifications, and strong they were. The primary impetus for the reconstruction of Tōdai-Ji was to, again, strengthen the authority of the throne in the midst of the war itself. Janet Goodwin remarks, quote, "The rebuilding of Tōdai-Ji and the way in which revenue was sought for the project was meant to strengthen the throne's claim to jurisdiction over all of Japan, in contrast to the more limited claims of the bushi, or the warrior houses involved in the Genpei War." Unquote. Since Tōdai-Ji represented not only a center of religious authority in pre-medieval Japan, but also a center of imperial authority, it should follow that its reconstruction would be prioritized and that the reconstruction would show the reach and the grasp of imperial power within Japan. This alone, however, does not explain the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa and Emperor Antoku's involvement in the project. Emperor Antoku, being a young child at the time of his ascension to the throne, was not old enough to administer the state, and so his grandfather, the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, took up the reins of imperial rule during young Antoku's tenure. Go-Shirakawa's role in the Genpei War, and therefore his motivation for rebuilding Tōdai-Ji, is extremely complicated. Though the Taira clan was aligned quite closely with the imperial court by way of their success in quashing the Heiji rebellion of 1160, Go-Shirakawa is often blamed in part for the defeat of the Taira clan during the Genpei War. This blame is attributed to him because many of his actions, which were issued under the name of his grandson Antoku, undermined the power and advantage of the Taira clan. One good example of such an action is precisely his campaign for Tōdai-Ji's reconstruction. As Goodwin remarks, he was not wholly concerned with the Taira clan winning the war. He was more concerned with the legitimacy and the strength of the imperial court's claim over the networks of resources and authority of the entire country. How did Chōgen get involved? By the time of his appointment to head up the reconstruction campaign, he was actually pretty old and had not achieved much acclaim for his career as a monk. However, he had a reputation derived from 2 successful campaigns for temple construction prior to his participation in Tōdai-Ji's, as well as several smaller projects. Additionally, he was a very strategic choice on the part of the emperor, who made the choice from interests serving his role as a religious authority as well as a political one. While some scholars do discuss Chōgen's interest and involvement in Pure Land Buddhism, they do not strongly connect that involvement to his candidacy as head of the reconstruction campaign of Tōdai-Ji. Specifically, Chōgen, although he was ordained in the Shingon tradition, is noted for having had a distinct interest in Pure Land Buddhism. There is evidence to suggest that he had studied and been influenced by such transformative Pure Land thinkers as Shandao, who lived from 613 to 681 in China, Genshin, who lived from 942 to 1017 in Japan, Kakuban, who lived from 1095 to 1143 in Japan, and Honen, who lived from 1133 to 1212 and is regarded as the founder of Japanese Pure Land Buddhism. Each of these figures will be discussed shortly. Chōgen's involvement with Pure Land Buddhism serves as a primary basis for his understanding of the complementarity between Mahavairachana, the main deity of Shingon Buddhism, and Amida, the main deity of Pure Land. And his involvement with Pure Land Buddhism very likely served as a potential reason for his popularity with provincial patrons and with common people. This popularity no doubt factored into his appointment on the campaign. The lineage of Chōgen's doctrine of complementarity begins at least as far back in time as Shandao. Shandao was a renowned pioneer of Pure Land Buddhist death rituals in China. In his treatise, Correct Mindfulness for Rebirth at the Moment of Death, he famously advocated that anybody seeking to achieve rebirth in Amida's Pure Land ought to, at the moment of their death, engage in visualization meditation of Amida's Pure Land and chant the Nenbutsu, Namu Amida Butsu. The reason why the right mindfulness at their last moment was so important to Shandao was because he believed, like all other thinkers we are going to discuss, that the world had entered into the final Dharma age, known as Mappo. In this age of the Dharma, the world is said to have become so marked by defilement and ignorance that enlightenment and Buddhahood were regarded as all but impossible through practice and study, and the only chance that practitioners had was to look for expedient practices, such as deathbed visualization practices, which would facilitate their subsequent rebirth in the Pure Land. The concept of the final Dharma age was foundational to the reform efforts of the Kamakura Buddhist reformers given the disasters facing Japan during the Kamakura period, and Shandao's deathbed practices became highly influential on Japanese death rituals during the Heian period and beyond. Shandao was notably influential on Japanese Pure Land monk Genshin, the author of The Essentials of Rebirth in the Pure Land, known as the Ojo Yoshu. This treatise built on the work of Shandao by collecting stories of people who had successfully executed such deathbed visualization practices as were prescribed by Shandao and had achieved rebirth in the Pure Land. Chōgen believed strongly in Amida and in his Pure Land, and in the final Dharma age in spite of his Shingon upbringing. By 1183, many of his followers had adopted monastic names in the Pure Land style, and during his career he built 7 separate worship spaces, known as Bushelle, on larger temple grounds which were dedicated to icons used in Pure Land Buddhist practice. Together, these indicate a strong Pure Land Buddhist influence on his career and that of his disciples. But Chōgen's relationship with Pure Land Buddhism goes even further than this. He is even thought to have met and debated with the founder of the Japanese Pure Land school, Jōdo, Honen himself, on the occasion of Honen's autumn debate at Ohara, a place in Japan, in the autumn of 1186. The nature of Chōgen's and Honen's relationship is mostly unknown, since the only documented evidence of it is in Honen's biographies and literature, but taken together with the rest of Chōgen's influences and career, a strong case can be made that his interests went beyond the Shingon orthodoxy of his time. While these are sufficient for understanding how and why Chōgen became so influenced by Pure Land Buddhism, it still doesn't really provide a root source for his doctrine of the complementarity between Amida and Mahavairachana. For that, one must look to the works of Kakuban, who we mentioned earlier as having lived from 1095 to 1143. Kakuban was a controversial Shingon Buddhist monk who was known for having created a schism in the community for attempting to revive and reform Shingon by taking leadership of both of the contemporary Shingon schools from Kongobuji on Mount Kōya, the center of Shingon Buddhism in Japan. This eventually resulted in the schism between old and new Shingon, which lasts to this very day. One of his most famous doctrinal innovations was the esoteric Nenbutsu, or the Himitsu Nenbutsu, an interpretation of the Nenbutsu as containing esoteric elements. In his treatise, The Esoteric Meaning of Amida, or the Amida Hishaku, he provides an esoteric analysis of each character in the Nenbutsu according to Kūkai's esoteric philosophy of language. In it, he treats the Nenbutsu like an esoteric mantra, wherein each character of the phrase has a magic and salvific power for the practitioner and for invoking Amida Buddha. In this treatise, Kakuban even went so far as to proclaim that Amida and Mahavairachana were truly manifestations of the same primordial force, and thus, to worship one was to worship the other. Furthermore, he argued that the Pure Land of Vairachana, commonly regarded as being all of reality, encompasses Amida's Pure Land, further cementing their congruence with each other. This being the case, Chōgen's proclamation of the complementarity of Amida and Mahavairachana already contained some precedent in the work of Kakuban, controversial though it was in the Shingon community. This doctrinal foundation for the Reconstruction campaign, as mentioned before, not only strongly leveraged the popular Pure Land thinking of the laborers who were participating in the reconstruction of Tōdai-Ji, but it also likely strongly influenced his own vision for the reconstruction of the statue and of the temple space. Because of his noted presence in the budding Pure Land community and his interest in Pure Land thought, it is likely that Chōgen represented a bridge between esoteric and exoteric communities. During the time of Chōgen's career, it is clear that the Pure Land Buddhist movement had not yet disaffiliated itself from the state-aligned Tendai institution. However, Honen's misgivings with Tendai and Shingon were very clear. Before the Genpei War, Honen left Mount Hiei, the center of Tendai Buddhism, as a young man to study at various temples in Japan, including Kofukuji and even Tōdaiji, and he found no satisfaction there, leading him to relocate to Kyoto, where he began to address common people of low social standing or of distasteful professions who were often excluded from Buddhist monastic practice. This is where he first began to gain a following for his Pure Land teachings and where his new movement of Pure Land Buddhism began to take shape. However, his teachings and his movement gained him numerous critics, especially from the state-aligned Tendai school, and around the time of the Tōdaiji Reconstruction campaign, he would have been a controversial figure in the community. Thus, if one believes that Chōgen had the positive relationship with Honen that was depicted in Honen's biography, the Honen Shonin Eden, then selecting Chōgen to head up this campaign would have represented the emperor's interest in bringing the Pure Land movement back under the purview of his power and influence. Chōgen's Pure Land influence goes even further with regards to his actual campaign. In his campaign for reconstructing Tōdaiji, he would travel to different provinces all around Japan, and he would fundraise, and at the same time, he would also install some temple spaces that were patronized by the emperor himself, so that in return, laborers from those communities would then come and work on the Tōdaiji reconstruction at the capital. Chōgen employed a method of leveraging his laborers' devotion to Pure Land Buddhism. The way he did this was he installed esoteric-style reliquaries in Pure Land halls that he had commissioned on these different estates all over Japan in return for the laborers' contribution to the reconstruction project. These reliquaries, called Gorin-to or Gorin-no-to, are miniaturized stupas which represent the 5 elements that pervade all reality according to Indian philosophy, and thus are very significant and important in esoteric Buddhism. Namely, the elements that are represented are earth, fire, water, wind, and space, and each one is represented by a component of the tower. These reliquaries came to be understood by the founder of Shingon in Japan, Kūkai, to represent the entirety of the Dharmakaya of Mahavairachana, which was understood in Shingon Buddhism to be constituted by the entirety of our phenomenal reality. Thus, to worship or show devotion to the reliquaries was to worship the Dharmakaya of Mahavairachana in an iconic form, meaning a form that is not the same as a statue or icon. Chōgen installed these little Gorin-to or Gorin-no-to inside his Pure Land halls alongside iconography of Amida and his Pure Land, signifying the complementarity and the unity of their worship. This connected the Pure Land worshippers to the great Buddha statue at Mahavairachana and Tōdaiji, and also to esoteric practice. This was all going on as they engaged in their own Pure Land worship. Similarly, this represented another point in which the dynamic of religious authority between esoteric and exoteric institutions had shifted. An examination of Chōgen's gifts of reliquary towers clearly shows that his campaign sought to reintegrate and reinforce esoteric Shingon's influence among devotees to the early exoteric Pure Land movement. However, on the other hand, Chōgen's doctrines of the complementarity of Amida and of Mahavairachana clearly shows that esoteric Buddhist Shingon institutions were themselves being influenced by the exoteric Pure Land movement. In this regard, exoteric Pure Land's influence can be said to have grown significantly among the esoteric, state-aligned institutions due to its controversial popularity among more common people. At the same time, esoteric Shingon influences were spreading to those very same spaces for common people to practice devotion to Amida and to the Pure Land. This interpenetration of esoteric and exoteric thought and practice, which was ignorant of social class and religious authority to a certain extent, was a critical point through which the reimagination of Tōdaiji ought to be understood. In other words, Chōgen's role in the Reconstruction campaign and his reimagination of Tōdaiji had farther-reaching implications than just the doctrinal nature of Amida and Mahavajracana, or even the relationship between state-aligned institutions and popular movements. It had implications for the entire landscape of Japanese Buddhism in the Kamakura period in the arenas of social class and religious authority. Although Chōgen's campaign was an innovative and effective means of connecting the Pure Land movement to the influence of the esoteric institution, his designs for the statue and the temple space were not without their prototypes and analogues. Chōgen is said to have commissioned the construction of 7 Bushelle during his Tōdaiji campaign. These Bushelle were constructed on the one hand as part of the transaction between the estates that were beholden to Tōdaiji financially, but on the other hand, they were also constructed to help oversee Chōgen's supply chain in the reconstruction process. Out of the 7 Bushelle that Chōgen himself commissioned throughout this campaign, some were portable worship spaces, but 3 were permanent Pure Land worship spaces that were installed at otherwise affiliated temple complexes. These 3 are the Kōya-san Shin Bushelle, the Jōdo-do at Gokuraku-san Jōdoji, and the Kanjin-sho at Tōdai-Ji. An examination of each of these spaces will demonstrate the overall pattern in Chōgen's installation of these spaces that influenced his Tōdaiji campaign. The Kōya-san Shin Bushelle was the first of Chōgen's Bushelle installations during this campaign. He installed the space at Mount Kōya, the center of Shingon Buddhism, and it was dedicated to Nenbutsu practice and visualization meditation, both of which are central to Pure Land devotion. The name has been changed, and it is now called Shinshū Ojoin, indicating that the space is specialized for the practice of Ojo, or rebirth in Amida's Pure Land. This means that it was likely used for deathbed practice, wherein the dying individual would, with the assistance of another practitioner, visualize Amida, chant the Nenbutsu, and attempt to facilitate their rebirth in his Pure Land upon their deaths. This space was installed to the southeast of Kongobuji, the head temple of the complex, and the Konpon Daito, the fundamental tower, one of the most important monuments on Mount Kōya. Soon after commissioning this site, Chōgen commissioned the construction of the Jōdo-do, or the Pure Land Hall, at Gokuraku-san Jōdoji, which is located in modern-day Hyogo Prefecture and is affiliated with Shingon Buddhism. This Pure Land Hall was, according to Yoshiko Kainuma, very important to Chōgen's fundraising efforts because the iconography within appealed to a wide lay audience, thus generating much revenue through donations for his reconstruction project. Namely, the hall featured a statue program of a standing Amida triad gilt in gold. This standing statue program represents Amida, Kannon, and Seishi in their Raigo form. Seishi is Mahastamaprapta, the bodhisattva of meditation and wisdom, and Raigo is the form that these Buddhas take whenever they arrive to the practitioner at the moment of their death in order to take them to Amida's Pure Land. The word itself translates roughly to welcoming approach. Thus, this space's ritual use is likely to visualize one's own Raigo at the moment of their death. This particular space is installed to the west of the main worship space, the west being the direction of Amida's Pure Land. The main worship space of Jōdoji is dedicated to Yakushi, or the Medicine Buddha. The third of Chōgen's Bushelle is the Kanjin-sho at Tōdaiji. Tōdaiji, as has been discussed, was dedicated to Shingon Buddhism at the time, and the Kanjin-sho was installed there during Chōgen's reconstruction campaign. Fascinatingly, the name of this Bushelle is shared with the name in Japanese for the campaign for fundraising and reconstructing Tōdaiji. That word is kanjin, and it roughly translates to temple solicitation. However, it also can be understood as encouraging people to progress along the path of Buddhahood through chanted sutras. This Kanjin-sho space is also dedicated to Pure Land devotion, and it contains a seated Amida Triad statue program. The Amida Triad is, in this case, seated on lotus flowers in the form in which they would appear to inhabitants of Amida's Pure Land when they have already been reborn there. Thus, this space was likely used to assist in the practice of the 13 visualizations of Amida's Pure Land, which are prescribed in the Contemplation Sutra. This space was installed just to the west of the Great Buddha Hall, or the Dai-Butsu-den, in which the Great Buddha statue of Mahavajrayana can be found. That this space for Pure Land devotion was installed so nearby to the Tōdai-Ji Great Buddha Hall further reflects Chōgen's doctrine of the complementarity between Mahavajrayana and Amida, and the unity of worship and ritual between the two. As mentioned before, the fact that Chōgen's campaign deployed this doctrine of the complementarity of Mahavajrayana and Amida does not mean that he envisioned the Great Buddha Hall as being solely dedicated to Amida. In fact, Chōgen's plans show that the space had very typical characteristics of a Shingon ritual space. The center dais is occupied by Mahavajrayana. Then on his left is a small space for an image of the Diamond Realm Mandala, or the Kongokai Mandala. And on his right is a space for the Womb Realm Mandala, the Taizokai Mandala. These mandalas are hung facing each other on the eastern and western walls in proper Shingon form. Beyond the Diamond Realm Mandala is a dais for the Bodhisattva Kannon, in his esoteric form known as Nyoirin Kannon. And beyond the Womb Realm Mandala is a dais for the Bodhisattva Kokuzo Bosatsu. This esoteric form of Kannon holds the wish-fulfilling jewel and the Dharma wheel, and Kokuzo, also known in Sanskrit as Akashagarbha, is one of the 13 deities of Shingon Buddhism. Nyoirin, Kannon, and Kokuzo both appear in the Womb Realm Mandala, indicating that this space is meant to represent the Womb Realm by means of this three-dimensional statue program, which is quite common in Shingon temple spaces. Finally, at the four corners are four esoteric guardian deities. While this space was quintessentially Shingon, the Great Buddha statue himself took on generic characteristics which were shared among both esoteric and exoteric icons during the period. As Ingram notes, the original statue from the rededication of the temple in the 8th century had generic characteristics that could have represented any Buddha, and as a result, Chōgen was able to easily model his reconstructed statue on the original and create a shared representation of an esoteric and exoteric icon. Perhaps the most important of these generic shared characteristics is the mudra, which was being performed by Chōgen's Great Buddha statue, which is the bestowing fearlessness and wish-granting mudra, or the Semui Yoganin in Japanese. This mudra was widely used among icons of various Buddhas, including Amida, and so as a result, Chōgen's Great Buddha statue would have served as a mixed and complementary visual representation of Mahavajrayana and Amida. Additionally, there are records of both esoteric and exoteric rituals taking place in the reconstructed Daibutsu-den, where this statue would be held. In the Shunjōbō Chōgen shiryō shūsei, a history of all of the meritorious acts that were completed by this monk Chōgen, and in the Tōdaiji Zoryu Kuyoki, a history of the Tōdaiji temple, it is described in detail how Chōgen organized both esoteric and exoteric rites in the temple according to the precedent set by various abbots of the temple such as Kūkai, Kochi, and Eikon. The purpose of the exoteric rites was directed towards state protection and made use of the Golden Light Sutra, and the esoteric rites took on several forms whose purpose was directed at performing ritual functions for the ruling elite and for the Shingon school itself. This mixed ritual use is an important lens through which to understand the specific circumstances of early Kamakura-era Japanese Buddhism. Unlike in Kūkai's time, when exoteric referred to powerful state institutions, such as Hosso, Rishu, and the other Nara schools of Buddhism, the exoteric schools of Chōgen's time, such as Pure Land, were finding popularity among people who were not aristocrats or ruling elite. Thus, the power dynamic between the esoteric and exoteric schools of the Kamakura period were entirely different than during Kūkai's time in the Heian period. As a result, even though both Kūkai and Chōgen envisioned Tōdaiji as being able to house both esoteric and exoteric rituals, Chōgen's vision was more inclusive of common people than had been previously achieved before. The fact that both esoteric and exoteric rituals were carried out in this space further reflects Chōgen's doctrine of complementarity, but at the same time, it reflects the shift in religious authority among the esoteric and exoteric schools of Kamakura Buddhism. As mentioned before, the presence of the esoteric-style reliquaries in the provincial Pure Land halls reflects an effort of the state to spread influence of Shingon Buddhism into the exoteric world of the Pure Land movement, whereas the reimagination of the reconstructed Tōdaiji temple spaces as a mixed-use esoteric-exoteric ritual space with a mixed esoteric-exoteric icon reflects the increasing influence of the exoteric Pure Land movement in the esoteric state-aligned Shingon institution. Thus, the shift in religious and political authority between Shingon and Pure Land can be observed. This two-way shift is ignorant of social class and of the pre-existing barriers of religious and political authority. Chōgen's constructed worship spaces elevate exoteric Pure Land devotion, which appealed to the common people, to the level of the esoteric state-aligned institution, which fulfilled ritual functions for the ruling and spiritual elite, thus cutting across boundaries of social class in Kamakura, Japan. This has been a research project episode about my own research on the Tōdaiji reconstruction after the conclusion of the Genpei War by the monk Chōgen. I hope that you've learned something about Japanese history and Japanese Buddhist history, and I hope that you've learned about Tōdaiji and Chōgen, and also about how these doctrinal distinctions, such as esoteric and exoteric, can have real-world ritual and practical implications, such as which spaces are used for which kinds of rituals, and which schools are more popular among different groups of people in different social classes. Furthermore, I hope that you can see how this change over time has occurred, and such a power shift has problematized a lot of things that we previously thought about the transition from the Heian period to the Kamakura period, and specifically with regard to the Heian schools of Buddhism and the Kamakura schools of Buddhism. As a quick side note, I encourage everybody who's listening to look up all of these places that I have talked about, either in Google Images or on the internet somehow, and if you can, visit them. They're very gorgeous places with a lot of history and a lot of spiritual importance and a lot of beauty, and I think that you'll get a lot out of it. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.